this session, and it will be posted to my YouTube channel in case any of you want to check it out later. I will also send an email follow-up with this with the recording of this session. So thank you again for joining me. Again, this is Laurel McCombs with the Osborne Group, and we're here today to talk about effective special events. This is a topic that I think obviously interests a lot of people. We had pretty good participation today, and I'm pleased to have you all here with us. I think I want to just go over a couple of quick housekeeping things. As I mentioned, I will be recording this session and sending out that recording to you. I will also have a PDF of these slides available. If anybody would like to get in touch with me after the webinar, you can just shoot me an email and I will send you the PDF of these slides. I also will mention a handout that I have that if any of you are interested, again, I'll share my email at the end of this session. If any of you are interested in getting in touch with me for that handout, please let me know, or any other questions that you might have as follow-up to today. There is a Q&A box. If you have any questions throughout the session, please post them there. I'm going to stop a couple of times throughout the webinar and check that Q&A box and answer any questions you might have. If anything comes up after the webinar, I know sometimes during a webinar it's hard to come up with questions on the fly, but typically if you're like me, a few hours or a day later, I think, oh man, I really wish I would ask this question. Please feel free to get in touch with me afterward. I'm happy to answer any questions or clear up any confusion I might create for you today. So again, welcome. I'm Laurel McCombs with the Osborne Group. I know many of you are on our email list, and some of you are former clients. The Osborne Group is a full-service nonprofit management consultancy, and I've been with the Osborne Group for about 3 years now, and work with a variety of clients across the country. In my previous life, I worked with Big Brothers Big Sisters. I know we actually have some Big Brothers Big Sisters folks on the call today, so shout out to all of you. And we actually Big Brothers Big Sisters had a signature event across the country called Bowl for Kids' Sake, which I worked closely with for a number of years. And I've actually been out there on the ground, like all of you. I started my career with the Girl Scouts, where I did a lot of events. I did a lot of events that I liked doing, and I did a lot of events that I really didn't like doing. So I know that I'm not one of those consultants that is kind of sitting on high telling you all what you should do. I've been in the trenches, and I've suffered through events. I have put on events that were not effective, that were not getting good return on investment, and I've actually gone through the process of working with my CEO and with my board to phase out long time, much loved events because they weren't seeing the return on our goals that we needed them to see. They were sucking up staff resources and time that could be used to do other things. So I've been out there, I've been there, I've worked with organizations doing what you're doing, and I've actually done it myself. So hopefully we'll get to some really good information today. Oh. Okay. I think I hit stop share, but I think I should be sharing with you all again. Okay, so today's agenda. I want to talk a little bit about what we're not going to talk about today, and I do this because when I start to talk about events, I do get people who kind of want to talk about certain things that we're just not going to talk about, and those things tend to be, I get a lot of questions about, well gosh, Laurel, what kind of event should we do? You know, should we do a gala? Should we do a golf tournament? I'm not going to talk about that today. The bottom line is we're going to talk mainly today about goals and metrics and the things that are going to help you to assess and evaluate whether or not your events are working. Now, those are the kinds of questions you want to be asking yourself. As you go out and look for the right event for your organization, you want to do it from a data-driven way, not from a, I heard from some guy over at that organization that this was a really great idea. You want to find the things that work for you. And you can only do those from a data-driven perspective, which we're going to talk a lot about today. I'm also not going to talk about special event planning from the perspective of, building a timeline, or kind of, what are the details that we need to address, what should we be doing 6 months out, 10 months out. That's kind of a whole nother webinar. Today, what we really want to focus on as we talk about making events effective is we want to talk about why data matters, and why data matters especially for events. And then we want to talk about setting strategic event goals. Why does that matter? What are some of the goals that you might set for your event? We want to make sure that you find the right metrics to measure success on those goals, because obviously setting goals without having a way to measure progress isn't very helpful to us. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about, once we have set our goals, we've measured our progress, we've looked at some key data points, how do we make course corrections? How do we shift, maybe make adjustments in what we're doing? And how do we make tough decisions about events? And, again, I've been there. I've had to look at a much beloved, long-running event and make some really tough decisions. And how do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that's really effective for the organization? So first, let's talk a little bit about developing a data-driven culture. And those of you who have been on past webinars with me, I've used this slide a couple of times, both in my effective metrics session that I did last year, as well as the session I did just a couple of months ago on building a fund development plan. And any of you who haven't had a chance, weren't able to join us for those webinars, those can also be found on my YouTube channel, or you can find links to those on the Osborne Group blog. But I want to talk a little bit about why data is so important. It's really not just about setting a few goals or pulling a couple of reports. This is about creating a culture. It's about looking at changing the way we think about how we set goals, right? In the past, a lot of organizations set goals by looking at what they did last year and adding 10%. I mean, I worked for an organization that did that. That was how we set our goals every year. We said, what did we do last year? Let's do 10% better. And it wasn't about whether or not we even hit the goal the previous year. We actually literally looked at what the goal was the previous year, and we tried to do 10% better. We didn't look at progress to goal. We didn't look at how the goals were, what was working, what wasn't working. We just kind of said, this is what we did, let's do better. Which is good. Striving for better is good, but it wasn't really based in anything. And ultimately, when we set goals based on last year's performance, if we're not digging deeper to really look at the strategies that we're using to enact those goals, looking at the results of those strategies in a detailed way, and looking at the data from those results to set our goals, we're really doing ourselves a disservice, because we're not taking advantages of our strengths, right? Because we may not even realize that we have strengths if we're not looking at the data effectively, and we're definitely not addressing our weaknesses. So we really want to make sure that this isn't just about, let's throw a couple metrics into the mix and suddenly we're going to answer all of our questions. This is bigger than just pulling a couple of reports. This is really about shifting culture. So I want to start, we're going to do a little poll. I'd love to hear from all of you. I'm going to launch this poll. I'd love to hear from those of you who are on the phone. How many events do you hold each year? I'd love to just kind of get a sense from all of you on the phone. Some of you might be like, we don't have any. That's why I'm on this call, because we're going to add some and see how that works. Are you doing one or two really big events? A lot of organizations have moved toward, trimming some of the fat with their events and just doing one or two big events a year, doing 3 to 5. I'll give you just a couple more seconds to choose. Looks like we have a few people who haven't voted. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to end the poll and share these results. So it looks like we don't have anybody who's doing none, because that's probably fair enough. This topic probably wouldn't be that interesting to people who aren't doing any events. A handful of you are doing 1 or 2, handful are doing 3 to 5, and we have several, actually almost half of you, that are doing more than 5 events per year. And so I think especially for those of you who are in that more than 5 category, I think this is I'm really glad you're on this webinar today, because I don't, I will be honest, I don't love events, and that's probably the scars that I still hold from getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go park cars at Laguna Seca during the races. I probably do hold a lot of scars, like we all do, from the treachery of the things we've had to all do to run events. But I'm not here today to bag on events. I think absolutely what we're going to talk about today is the fact that events have a very special role within our organizations and within our fund development programs. And we need to make sure that that role is a balanced role. So I'm not here today to say, get rid of all your events. I'm here today to say, make sure that those events you're doing are awesome. Make sure that those events you're doing are helping you achieve your mission and your vision. Make sure that they're effective. Make sure that they're efficient. Make sure that you feel really good about the outcomes that you're getting from them. And if you feel like you're spending too much time, especially again for those of you in that 47% that are doing more than 5 events a year, think about, we're going to talk about opportunity cost in a little bit. Think about, is the time that you're spending on your events holding you back from doing other things? So thanks for sharing that. So let's go back. Oh, I think I see again. Sorry for my. Okay, there we go. Back to sharing the screen. So again, I want to, before we jump into goals, setting goals and measuring goals, I want to just make sure that we have, we're all on the same page in terms of what the difference is between a goal and a metric. As it's funny, even as I was developing this session, I kept getting confused. Like I would come up with, these are the types of goals I want to talk about, and then as I was thinking about it, I was like, well, those aren't really goals. Those are metrics, right? That's a way we measure something. That's not really a goal. And vice versa. I'd be coming up with metrics and I'd be like, well, no, that's not a metric. That's a goal. And so finally I was like, I need to get this straight for myself. And I thought, gosh, if I'm having a hard time with it and I'm supposed to be the expert here sharing information with you, I want to make sure we get on the same page. So what is the difference between a goal and a metric? So first of all, a goal is a measurable, achievable action or state, right? It is somewhere that we want to be, and we have some way to measure it, and we feel confident in our ability to achieve it, right? Whereas a metric is a guideline, right? It's a benchmark that's used over time to encourage good or effective behaviors, right? So if our goal is to establish a good or effective behavior, the metric is the guideline by which we encourage that, right? So it's really, when we break it down, it's really the difference between what we want to achieve versus how we're going to achieve it, right? So if I say, I want to raise more money, right? If that's my goal, my metric is, measuring how much money I raise, right? I think the way I have found to really help me make the distinction is that a goal motivates us, whereas a metric measures, right? So metrics, a lot of times people will pose metrics in the form of goals. People will say, well, I want to increase my donor retention rate. That's a valid goal. But donor retention rate in and of itself, that number, right, whatever it is, whether it's 32% or 62%, the metric of donor retention is just a number. It's just a measurement. What becomes a goal is when we say we want to increase donor loyalty, and to do that, we need to increase our donor retention, right? We want to increase our donor retention rate by 10 percentage points, right, or by 15%. Next year. That's motivating, right? So setting a goal is saying we want to achieve some action or state, and our metric is the way we're going to measure it. So hopefully that helps you guys. It helps me to think through it. And as we go through this, I think that distinction is going to become a lot more clear. I also just want to establish a baseline when we're talking about events. These are some of the events that I'm talking about. And as we go through these pieces, I think each of you are going to think about some particular events you're doing, but I want to make a distinction that I'm not just talking about fundraising events, because ultimately, you guys are doing a lot of different events. You're doing fundraising events, obviously those things that bring in money, right? That's probably the main type of event you're doing. You might also be doing cultivation events, things that people don't pay to go to, right? They're free, but the purpose of them is to cultivate donors, steward donors, recognize them. These are things that tend to be hosted by board members or maybe other donors. You have celebration events, right? So things like stewardship events, celebrating a new office building, or celebrating a campaign goal that you've hit, things like that. Again, these tend to be cultivation events or stewardship events. Typically, these things are, free events that we're inviting people to in order to honor them and celebrate accomplishments. And then you have leadership events, and so these might be more volunteer focused. So this might be like an annual meeting where you recognize volunteer leadership or board leadership. And again, it's an opportunity that where you're cultivating, you're stewarding people, you're demonstrating your mission. In all of these events, I kind of specifically put mission-based and mission-infused in front of the first two, but the reality is all of these things are mission-based and mission-infused, right? So we always want to be coming at this from the perspective of our mission, right? I often hear from people, how often they'll put on an event and then they'll hear somebody talking about it the next day, and they'll say it was for some totally different organization, right? I mean, the worst thing we can do is put a ton of time and effort into putting on an event to only have people walk out the next day and tell people how great the event they went to was, but then list some other organization, right, as the person who put it on. So it has to be based on our mission. It has to be infused with our mission. People, no matter what kind of event it is, people have to leave that event knowing who they supported, knowing why the organization they supported matters. So I think it's really important. And then, of course, there's non-development events, right? So often as fund development professionals, we're so zeroed in on our activities that we sometimes don't look outside of fund development for opportunities that might exist. And I throw this in because, especially for those of you who are trying to cut down on the number of events that you're having, you might look at, are there other non-development events? So programmatic events that your program team or your marketing team or other people in your organization are putting on that you can piggyback on and create some efficiencies around. Do you have a really big event that happens for clients that would actually make for a really great cultivation event for donors? Could you piggyback on an existing program event that would actually bring donors front and center to the people you serve, show them firsthand, give them the opportunity to maybe talk to some of the people that you serve, hear firsthand what outcomes you're achieving, the impact of their gifts, things like that. So again, when you think about events, don't be so narrow focused to just think about fundraising, but think about other events that your organization is doing so that you can piggyback on those. I want to jump in and do another poll really quick here before we jump into goals. Before we talk about some of the goals, I'd love to hear from all of you. What are your goals for your special events? When you think about the events that you have right now, are they primarily for raising money? I'm guessing that's what most of you are going to say, but some of you might, say, no, actually, some of our events actually are really good for acquiring new donors. They're really important in how we engage and steward existing donors. Some of you might say that they're about marketing and raising awareness. A lot of organizations have actually made that shift to say, we don't expect revenue from our events. This is really about market share, raising awareness, getting the word out, or maybe you have some other completely different goal that I haven't listed here. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds to vote on that. I'm going to close in just 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1, and I'll share that with you. So it looks like, as I thought, about half of you raising revenue. I'm actually really pleased to see so many of you that are, using your events for engaging and stewarding existing donors, and even, a small percent that are acquiring new donors. Again, not good or bad, right? None of these things are better than the others. It's about what your organization needs. So I'm going to stop sharing this and let's jump into goals for the year event. I'm just going to check in up here. Okay, looks like everything's A-okay. So first and foremost, revenue, right? And again, let's remember a goal is a desired state, right? A goal is what we're trying to achieve. So a lot of you set revenue goals for your events. And I want to talk about the fact that, hopefully when you're thinking about revenue goals for your events, they're bigger than just the bottom line number, right? Obviously that is always going to be a goal. It's in your budget. It is what it is, right? The amount you have to raise. But hopefully that you're all looking at setting goals beyond that, because again, if we're only ever looking at the bottom line number, it's really hard for us to get deeper into how that number is happening, right? So, it's kind of like I say to myself, gosh, I want to lose 10 pounds. And if I just say to myself, I want to lose 10 pounds, and then 2 weeks later, I jump on the scale and I have lost 1 pound, but I haven't been paying any attention to what I've been eating. I haven't been paying any attention to how much water I've been drinking or how much exercise I've been getting. And I haven't set any goals around those things, right? It's really hard for me to know why I may or may not be working toward my goal of losing 10 pounds, right? Whereas if I say to myself, all right, I want to lose 10 pounds, so I'm going to set a goal to drink 8 glasses of water every day, and I'm going to set a goal to exercise for 30 minutes every day, and I'm going to set a goal to reduce my calorie intake by I'm going to eat 1,500 calories a day or whatever it is. Then suddenly I've set these other goals, and I can then start to measure whether or not I'm doing that. I can look at those metrics and see when I get 2 weeks out and I've only lost a pound, I can look back and say, well, did I achieve those other goals? So again, amount to be raised is important, but it's not the only thing. So we want to look at things like return on investment, right? So, down here we've got some recommended standards around, what percentage you should be spending on direct expenses versus staff time as an expense. And I know all of you have heard this. It's something that we have been talking about in the nonprofit sector for a very, very long time, which is making sure that you are including staff time as an expense in your calculations for return on investment for events. And, every organization I talk to kind of like nods their head and rolls their eyes like, yes, Laurel, I know, but still so very few organizations are actually doing it. And I don't know if it's because it's hard, because it's like an extra step that they have to do and they don't want to take the time to calculate it, or if they're scared to do it, right? Because if they actually put staff time in as an expense, the numbers would be shocking and they would realize that they had no choice but to shift, right? Because of opportunity costs. And this is another thing I kind of mentioned earlier, but I want to really make sure we talk about today. Understanding opportunity costs, which is what could our staff be doing differently if they weren't doing this, right? So one of the biggest reasons we have to measure staff time as an expense is because we have to know how much of our staff time is going to this event. What is the return? What are we making for that staff time versus what could our staff be doing around cultivating donors, stewarding donors, researching donors, doing other leadership and major gift work that could actually be producing a bigger return. So again, if you're doing this already, bravo, awesome, way to go. Hopefully you're seeing good results with it. Hopefully you're really using that number as a way to make tough decisions. If you're not doing it, you have to do it. There's no way otherwise to truly evaluate revenue for your events. So I'm going to get off my soapbox about that now. So obviously revenue goals, there's a lot of things. Revenue diversification, I will just make one quick note about that, which is we really do want to make sure that we're not only looking at how our special event revenue is looking within itself, kind of what is the role of our events within our broader revenue picture, right? I've worked with a lot of organizations over the years that have said, gosh, we really need to lessen our reliance on special events. And we want to do more focused work on major gifts, or we want to do more corporate partnership work versus sponsorship work, whatever it may be. The reality is that if you're not consistently looking at the revenue of your event as it relates to the revenue, to your overall revenue, you're never going to make that shift, right? So a lot of people talk about lessening reliance and about diversifying their portfolio, but they're not actually actively looking at metrics or setting goals around how they're going to make that shift, right? And so this kind of comes back to opportunity costs, because we're saying, well, if we really are going to make the shift and lessen our reliance on events, it means that maybe we need to divert staff time, right, from doing events to doing some of these other activities. So let's talk a little bit about attendee and volunteer goals, and this is around the event in and of itself, right? So for the event, a lot of attendance goals, a lot of people will measure attendance. They'll say, we had 300 people last year, we want to get 350 people this year, and we got 340, so we feel pretty good about that, right? So that's kind of typically how we look at attendance goals. I really want to push you guys as you're thinking about your goals, not just to set goals around getting the right number of people there, but getting the right people there, right? So great that you got 40 more people, but were they 40 people who, aren't really people who you're looking to put into your donor pipeline? Maybe they're not people who are actually interested or don't have inclination to give to your organization. Maybe they're just guests who kind of came for a good time. Are they the right people in that they are potentially people who might want to get involved deeper in the organization as a volunteer? Are they the right people because they know more of the right people, right? So take a little time as you're setting your goals. A lot of people don't even really know or ever have a conversation about who the right people are, right? Who are those people? And if you're not sure what that looks like, think about the people who, and you can all do this. I bet you could all on the spot think of 5 people who have come to your events in the last 2 or 3 years who have just turned out to be awesome, right? Who have either become major donors or who are on your board now or joined the volunteer committee. Think about those people. Think about who invited them. Think about demographics, what business are they in? Where do they live? What's their age? Things like that. What circle do they run in? And if you're finding some trends, some consistencies, try to get more of those people, to come to your event. So think about not just how many, but, not just quantity, but quality. Think about board participation. We're going to go through some metrics on this in a little bit, but what are your goals around board participation? And some of you may say, rightly so, we don't want the board to participate in this because we want them to be doing other things as it relates to fundraising. Or some of you might say this is the main way that the board, participates in fundraising. So we definitely have to set some goals around how they're going to support this event. Think about your volunteer committee. A lot of special events are made or broken based on their volunteer committees. So set some goals and make sure when you're talking about board and volunteer committee goals that you're setting them with your board and volunteer committee, not for your board and volunteer committee. This is something that you should be sitting down with them and having discussions about, what are your goals in terms of the number of, and individual and team goals. So for how much, what do we expect each person on the volunteer committee for this event to do in terms of invites or in terms of raising funds or in terms of their own personal commitment and financial support of the event. And then finally, of course, stewardship. And this is a big one, which kind of we'll talk about a lot today because it's so important. But making sure that you have goals around how you're going to steward people for this event, right? Your attendees, your boards members, your volunteer committee members, your hosts, and making sure that you have a multi-level stewardship plan for this event that addresses those people in different ways, right? Because we want to steward some of our bigger donors and some of maybe our table hosts or our team captains and people like that. We're going to steward them differently than we're going to steward, attendees. Maybe somebody who just came as a guest but didn't contribute as much. So make sure you have that multi-layered stewardship and make sure you have all of these goals written down. Now let's talk a little bit about non-event donor management goals. And when I say this, what I mean is these are goals you're setting around your event, but they're kind of goals that you have for how you're going to move people through because of this event, but how you're doing donor management through your event that affects donors outside of the event, right? So we talked a little bit, in the poll, several of you said that you use your events as ways to engage and steward donors. And so that's a really great example. So, how are we using this event as a way to acquire new donors, fill our donor pipeline? How are we providing meaningful engagement opportunities? For a lot of our donors, organizations really struggle with finding meaningful donor engagement opportunities. It's not something that comes easy to a lot of organizations. So events are in some ways a really powerful tool for doing that, right? For a lot of organizations, it's the only way that they really have to get people involved in something and get them engaged in something, not just reading your monthly newsletter, but actually getting them face to face and having an opportunity to talk to them, to show them some of your outcomes and impact. And similarly with stewarding your donors, creating joy and demonstrating impact. For some of you, events are the only way that you're able to do this. You can't get lunch with them, or they're traveling all the time, just don't have time to do a meeting. Maybe they're not interested, or they don't have time to join your board or join another committee. They don't have time to be a program volunteer. So events become a really powerful tool for you. But make sure that if in fact this is one of your goals, if in fact this is one of the things that your event is achieving, that you have written goals for what this is going to do, right? So this isn't just about saying, well, we think that this is a good stewardship opportunity, right? This is about setting distinct goals about how these events are going to achieve that for you. So, how many donors are you going to engage? How many prospective donors are you going to acquire and put into your pipeline? How will this impact stewardship? Implementing think, feel, do. This is a really important piece we talk about this a lot when we talk about events at the Osborne Group, which is that every time you talk to a donor, and particularly at your events, you want to make sure that you're implementing think, feel, and do messages. So, the think and feel, this is really getting to that whole kind of talk to the head, talk to the heart thing, right? We want to make sure we're appealing to both the head and the heart. We want to make sure that we have messages that really make people think about what we're doing. So sharing impact statistics, outcomes, really demonstrating through people from a very specific way what we're achieving and what our impact is on the community, but then also doing that in a feel way, right? So not through facts and figures, but through stories and through anecdotes about the people we serve, tugging at people's heartstrings. And then finally, we want to make sure that we have do messages, right? So it isn't just about making people understand our impact and feel really great about our impact, but making them do something about it. So all of your events should have some do message, so some follow-up, some way that people can get, or hopefully multiple ways that people can get involved, and a way for you to actively follow up with them. So make sure that if in fact you intend to do these things through your events, that you're actually writing down what your goals are around this. Again, other goals I hear a lot. for events, marketing and public relations goals. This is something that actually I tend to hear a lot as an excuse. I'll be really honest. This is one of those things that, when I pushed organizations to say, is this event really working for you? They'll say things like, well, you don't understand, this event gets us so much publicity, right? It's something I hear a lot from organizations. But if I were to push them and say, okay, fair enough, what kind of publicity does it get you? And what are your goals around getting publicity? They couldn't tell me, right? Because it's not actually a goal. It's more of an excuse for keeping the event. So again, totally valid if marketing and public relations is a primary goal for your event. That is absolutely valid. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are some organizations that have moved away from relying on events as revenue generators and have actually shifted their thinking entirely and recognized that events are better suited to them as a marketing and a new donor acquisition tool, right? So as a way to get media exposure, raise awareness, and bring new people into the fold. And if in fact that is the purpose of your event, great, thumbs up, really good, but make sure those goals are written down and that you have specific goals for what that is. So what are we talking about? Is it about media exposure? And if it is, what does success with media exposure look like for you? Is it about raising awareness? And if so, what does success look like for raising awareness? And make sure it's integrated with your marketing plan. So, all well and good if the development team thinks that this is about raising awareness and marketing, but if the marketing team's not on board with it and it's not integrated into their planning around what they're trying to do, then again, it's not as effective as we want it to be. Program goals, finally, the last kind of big goal, which is, getting more people to volunteer, engage volunteers, again, looking at kind of recognizing clients or service recipients or providing activities for clients or service recipients. Again, if these, like with the other ones, I'll kind of feel like I'm repeating myself, but I want to reiterate this. If in fact this is a goal of your event, great, but it has to be written down. And so the reason I keep saying this is, again, and some of you read my blog post last month on this, which is to say that so often when revenue is down on an event, or when we're not seeing the return on investment or the cost per dollar raised that we want to see on an event, when that happens, a lot of us, instead of making adjustments to the event or getting rid of the event completely, will kind of start coming up with these anecdotal reasons why the event is so important to us. And that doesn't mean that those things aren't true. Oftentimes they're absolutely true. But until we set and write down measurable, achievable goals related to those other areas, they're just excuses. So make sure that if in fact the purpose of your events is not just about revenue, but about some of these other things, make sure that you're writing those goals down and you're actually making sure that you set some goals. So it looks like we don't have any questions so far. Fair enough. I'm going to power through because I'm actually running a little bit behind, as any of you who've ever been on a webinar with me know that is kind of my MO, because I always tend to talk a little bit more than I think I'm going to, which is something I should learn about myself. So anyway, let's jump forward and talk about metrics. So we talked about the different kinds of goals that you want to set. And again, if we're remembering the distinction between a goal and a metric, goals is our desired state, right? It's where we want to go. It's what we want to achieve. And metrics are how we're going to figure out how we get there, right? It's how we measure progress. So goals motivate us to achieve things. Metrics help us to measure, right? Whether or not we're going to do that. So metrics get tricky, right? Because there is so much that we can measure. I am kind of a data nerd. I love talking about this stuff. As you guys can probably imagine, you're probably all sitting at your computers thinking she is way too excited about talking about metrics. And especially if you were on the metrics call I did last year. Again, I think I think this stuff is exciting. And the reason I think it's exciting is because I don't like unanswered questions, right? I don't like to live in a world of ambiguity. I like to understand why things are happening. I'm the daughter of a psychotherapist, and I always joke that that's probably affected me in more ways than I even know, and primarily has affected me in the fact that I even am trying to analyze how it affects me, right? But I think to some extent I always want to get to the root cause of things, and we can't do that unless we have facts, unless we have data. But the flip side of metrics is, it's kind of the old analysis paralysis that everyone talks about. You can just get buried by it, right? We could all spend all of our time just running data and looking at numbers and talking about it and never actually doing anything about it. So, first and foremost, we have to be realistic. We're going to talk about a lot of metrics here in the next 15 minutes or so. And I don't want you to walk away from this feeling like I'm telling you have to implement all of these metrics. What I want to do is I want to give you an overview of some of the metrics you can use to evaluate and to measure your goals, because I want to help you find the right ones, right? I don't want to make you use 50 new metrics. I want you to use like 3 or 4, right? I want you to pick the right ones for you. I've read a lot of articles. I read a lot of blog posts and articles about this kind of stuff. And, I'm always finding blog posts that say things like the 3 metrics you have to be using, or the top 5 metrics for this. And I think it's great because it always gives those kinds of articles always give me really good ideas. But the danger is, I'm definitely not a proponent of kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to how we run our development offices. You all are different. You struggle with similar challenges. You face similar barriers. You have similar strengths across the nonprofit sector, but the distinct challenges that you have and the distinct questions that you're facing are different across your organizations. So you have to find the right metrics for you. And it has to be integrated into the rest of your plan, because of course you're not just looking at metrics for your events at any one time. You're looking at metrics for your whole fund development plan. So as you're thinking about which metrics you'll use for your events, also think about, are you using complementary metrics for your other development activities? So if you start to look at donor retention, for example, for your events, are you also looking at donor retention for your leadership giving? Are you looking at donor retention for direct mail? Are you looking at donor retention for foundation grant writing? For all of the different ways that for each of your different strategies in your fund development plan, is there a way that you can create some consistency so that you can do some benchmarking and comparisons and see which of your strategies are working better than others, which also helps you at a higher level, not just within your development plan. Figure out your gaps and challenges, right? As you set your goals, it's why we started with goals, right? Because we want to make sure that we know what our goals are first, because our goals are really going to dictate what we want to measure, right? And your goals are where you're going to start to see gaps. So if you have a goal around, increasing the number of repeat attendees from year to year, that's going to dictate our metric, right? So if our main goal is around donor retention, then we're going to measure donor retention. There's basically things like that. I do want to say, though, as we start to go through these metrics, that it isn't always kind of one-to-one. So as I talk about revenue metrics, yes, revenue metrics help us to measure revenue goals, but sometimes other types of metrics also help us get to other kinds of goals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through some of these metrics. The bottom line is, what's keeping you up at night? This is the question. When I was in the trenches, like all of you, and I was raising money, there would just be certain things that, that moment when you're lying in bed before you go to sleep, and it's like the worst time, right? Because all of the stresses from the day are kind of running through your head, and that's when you tend to have those like, oh, blah, moments, right? Where you're like, oh, what am I going to do about that? Think about that, and write it down. Like, what are those things that when your head is totally cleared, or as you're falling asleep and you have those like panic thoughts that come into your head about your events, write those panic thoughts down, because a lot of times panic thoughts are about ambiguity, right? We tend to have those panicky thoughts about things that we don't know the answer to. So if in fact we don't know the answer, then that's going to dictate what we measure, because we need to get the answer to it, right? So, and then also think about what you can measure consistently and accurately. I think this is important, because the reality is that, you know, there may be plenty of things that I want to measure, but I don't have the means to do it. Either you don't have the software to do it, or you just don't have, you know, access to the right surveying tools, or you don't have, you haven't been asking the right questions of your participants to get the data you want. If in fact you find that there are certain metrics that you're dying to have, that you just really know are going to answer the questions you need to get answered, but you can't measure them consistently and accurately, then figure out how, right? Figure out how to answer them consistently and accurately. And maybe that means investing in a new CRM system, or maybe that means picking a different event registration platform, or, you know, something. A lot of times this stuff comes down to technology, and there's so much technology out there, and the technology is getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. It used to be that I think cost was such a big barrier to organizations implementing the kind of technology that could give them metrics that were really useful. But, you know, there are so many nonprofit CRM, nonprofit event software companies out there now that are smaller companies that are offering packages and offering platforms that can actually do some pretty great stuff for a lot cheaper than they have in the past. So I think that technology barrier is lessening. So let's get in, now that we've kind of thought about how we choose the metrics, I'm going to get into some of the metrics you might choose. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm actually working on a fairly big list, which when that is done, I'll kind of launch that out to our mailing list. This is just to get your head going around some of these things. And as I go through this, if any of you have follow-up questions, or if any of this, if I'm going too fast, because I'm going to have to go through this pretty quickly as we're running toward the end of our session here. But if any of this doesn't make sense, or you have more questions, again, please feel free to get in touch with me after the webinar. So revenue metrics, what are some of the things we can look at? Obviously, gross revenue, net revenue. The one I want to highlight on here, because I think most of you know what the rest of these mean, is net per participant. This is an interesting kind of next level metric for those of you who are really nerdy. Net per participant is basically taking your net revenue and dividing it by the number of attendees, right? So looking at what is, you know, not just looking at, and this is a little bit like looking at average gift size, but instead average gift size, you know, kind of looks at gross revenue, whereas net per participant looks at net revenue per participant. What's great with looking at this number is, especially if you can kind of do benchmark net per participant metrics for the last couple of years, as you're planning your event and as you're getting participants, you have a better sense of how many participants you're going to need to get to your ultimate revenue goal. So it's a great way to kind of provide and get an initial sense of when you're going to hit a positive return on investment in terms of the number of attendees that you're going to need. So again, probably a next level metric, but can be a really interesting one to look at. New donor metrics. So this is pretty obvious, you know, number of new participants, number of new sponsors. This is a really great metric for those of you who want to figure out whether or not your event is hitting marketing and PR goals, right? So again, this is an example of how we're going to talk about some marketing and PR metrics in a second, but actually a new donor metric can actually be a great metric to test your marketing and PR goals, because if in fact you're doing a really great job of using this event to raise awareness, to engage new people in the community, what better way to test whether or not you're hitting that goal than by measuring the number of new participants that come to the event, right? Retention metrics. And again, we talk so much about retention. I feel like I've said that word already a ton of times in this session, but it's important. And this is actually upgrade metrics here as well. Participant metrics, make sure you're looking at your sponsors as well. How good of a job are you doing at keeping people? And look at dollars gained and lost. This is another one. Typically when we look at retention, we tend to talk about the number of donors, right? We tend to talk about the number of participants, what percentage of the number of participants returned from last year. But if you can translate that into dollars, if you can actually translate of those who came last year, who came again this year, how many dollars did we gain or how many dollars did we lose from those retained donors? That can really start to help you with your revenue goals, right? Start to give you some explanations around why your revenue may or may not be achieving the goals that you want it to achieve. Look at things like upgrades, and again, dollars gained and lost from upgraded donors. So you can, if you're measuring this and you're tying it back to your overall revenue goals, you're able to say like, oh gosh, actually, us not retaining participants, we're losing $5,000 a year by not retaining our participants, right? So maybe next year you implement some strategies to do better with retention. Board and committee metrics. Again, we talked about some of those goals, but we also want to make sure that we have some metrics. So how many personal gifts? What are the dollars raised? Yes rates, right? So set some, you can measure for, let's say, your volunteer committee, each says they're going to invite 10 people. How many of those 10 people said yes? What this does is it helps you to look at best practices, right? So if you have some people who, out of the 10 people they invited, 8 people came, and other people, only 2 people came, let's dig into what the person who had 8 people come did, right? Let's find some best practices. Let's have them be a role model to some of the other committee members to talk about why they were so successful with that. Again, donor management metrics. So these are things at the event. So let's set some, let's measure how many planned strategic donor initiatives did we have for this event? So, if in fact we set a goal where we said, yes, our goal is that we are going to engage donors. We're going to engage, 50 donors at this event. Well, how many planned donor initiatives did we have? Did we have a plan for each of those 50 donors? Did we actually execute that plan? And did we actually secure some follow-up with those people, right? Look at things like donor conversion rate, which is a great number. How many people who come to your events actually also then give an annual fund, a leadership, or a major gift outside of the event? So this is kind of the bottom line number, right? If in fact your goal is to use an event to fill your donor pipeline, to engage donors, to steward donors, no better way to test that than to measure donor conversion, right? To test whether or not people are actually coming to your event and then becoming annual fund donors, right? So that's a great number to look at. Marketing and PR metrics, media impressions, page views, social media posts and mentions. Again, this should be coordinated with your marketing department. It doesn't necessarily help for development in a silo to be looking at these things if that data isn't relevant to what the marketing department is looking at and what they're trying to do. So make sure that you're coordinating that. Peer-to-peer metrics. I know some of you do peer-to-peer fundraising, friends asking friends. There's some really interesting, I think, metrics specific to those kinds of events, ways that you can look at both individual fundraisers and teams when you're doing that. So looking again at things like retention. I love average dollar raised, I think is a great metric, because again, not only do we start to see what people are raising, but we start to be able to pull out best practices, right? We start to be able to see, oh gosh, this person's doing really great. Let's go talk to them about what they're doing. It helps us, when we can find metrics that help us uncover best practices, then that's how we best turn numbers into practice, right? Numbers into strategy. Look at things like how many emails get sent and how many social media posts your fundraisers are sending and what the conversion rates are on that. You know, are you seeing that people who have more personalized pages are getting more donations? And if so, how do you then, you know, encourage more of your fundraisers to create personalized pages, things like that. So, you know, again, I know I kind of sped through a lot of data and a lot of information here. And again, it wasn't to kind of make you feel overwhelmed or make you feel like, oh my gosh, I need to be measuring all of these things. But I think the purpose was to give you an overview of how you can be approaching this, how you can be approaching setting goals and measuring those goals. But the reality is you've got to be putting it all together. You've got to be, again, this is, you know, the chart we showed in the very beginning, you've got to be, you know, putting it all in context. Data without context is meaningless, right? A number is just a number. Data that isn't tied to a goal doesn't really do anything for us. Just like I said in the beginning, just like a goal that we don't measure doesn't do anything for us, right? We have to put all of these things together, and then we have to actually shape our strategies based on it. We actually have to change something because of what we learn. So if we set a goal and we measure progress against that goal, and we find out that we're not achieving what we thought we were, then we've got to change direction, right? And this is where things get hard, because it's a lot easier to talk about making adjustments and making changes than it is to actually make them. So, you know, just a few things to keep in mind that as you're going through this, you know, review your goals, review achievement to goals. If you end up like this poor little guy here, get input, right? Dig into your data look both at your statistical data, right? So look at your objective data, look at, try to find some trends, try to dig in and understand why you're not seeing what you're seeing. Get input from people, right? So take that data. Once you have the data, and you're starting to see trends in the data, take it to other people. Share it with your volunteer committees. Share it with your board. Share it with your leadership teams. Share it with staff and other donors. Share it with those key stakeholders, especially those people who are closest to the event. Get their input. Are there adjustments you can make? Are there changes you can make to the event to solve some of the problems you're having? Or is it really just time to cut strings with this event and move in a different way? If in fact you think that getting rid of an event is the best way to go, I encourage you to think about your contingency plan, because ultimately you are going to have to replace some revenue, right? You don't want to lose the people who have been involved in that event. So think about how you're going to engage them. Put a written plan in place. Create a written transition plan for that event so that you actually have identified how are we going to engage existing participants and sponsors, how are we going to replace the revenue, and get buy-in, right? In some cases, you may even need to kind of create a case for support, right? For a case for why you're getting rid of this event, and make sure that you're getting buy-in from board members, from committee members, from people who really love and are close to the event. Make sure that people understand why you're making the change, and that they're behind it too. I'm just going to check. Looks like I have one question. Do you count volunteers, gala committee as participants, or as a participant only those who buy a ticket? How do you define? I think that's a good question. I kind of generally used the word participant in this webinar because I know that all of you are doing very different kinds of events. I would consider participant really anybody who comes to your event. I think it's important, though, as you look at metrics and as you set goals, segmenting is really important. So whatever kind of event you have and whatever goals you set, I think it's important to segment those goals and segment those metrics, because you want to look at differences between people who just buy a ticket right? Just people who attend versus people who actually volunteer at your event versus people who are actually on the committee for your event versus sponsors, right? Because sponsors are kind of different too, because all of those different segments of people engage in your event in a different way, kind of have different feelings towards your event. So I think it's important when you look at metrics, as much as you can, segment and look at metrics by different types of people. So hopefully that answered your question. Again, if any of you have additional questions, here's my email here, lmccombs@the Group. You will all be getting a recording of this webinar today. And I also do have, we have a really great, really basic but helpful event planning worksheet. If any of you are interested in getting a copy of that worksheet, please email me. Or if you're interested in getting a PDF of today's slides, please email me. You know, again, hopefully all of you are reading our blog on a regular basis. If there's any way that you know, I can be helpful following up with this webinar, please get in touch with me. And of course, if there is any way that the Osborne Group can be of help to your organization, please reach out to us. And I hope you guys all have a really great day and good luck with all of your event success. Thanks. Bye-bye.